All right, we are broadcasting. And I'm just giving people a moment to get in. All right, so we're going to get started because we have a lot to cover in our next hour. Thank you for joining us, and good evening, and welcome to the Special Education Legal Fund December webinar on of this school year. We are here to talk about school avoidance and refusal, a topic that is really timely for this time in the school year. And I'm looking forward to this opportunity to talk about these issues with this really great panel. I am Laura Sullivan, and I am the staff attorney for Self Legal Aid. And this is my second time both moderating and manning the slides. So please give me some grace as I don't have it down as well as Christine Lai, our executive director, did. Um, Before we get to the content, there are some housekeeping things. I want to thank Fusion Academy for sponsoring this webinar and providing one of our panelists, as we couldn't do the work we do without the generous support of all of our sponsors. And I would like to thank all of our corporate sponsors. If I can advance the slide, let's see. Yep, there we go. At the platinum level is Eagle Hill School and WealthSpire Advisors. At the gold level is Winston Preparatory School. In our silver level is American School for the Deaf, Villa Maria School, Chapel Haven Schleifer Center, Fusion, Spire School, and the Pinnacle School. And our bronze level sponsor is the Windward School. So again, thank you to all of our corporate sponsors. For you, those of you who may not be familiar with SELF, our mission is to provide resources and knowledge to families in need with children in the special education system. We seek to empower parents and guardians to fully advocate for their students and to level the playing field for families in need with children in special education. We do this through different programs. We provide grants for legal support and advocacy to families in need in Connecticut and Westchester County, New York, through our Attorney Grant and Advocacy Grant Program. And beginning this past September 2025, we began providing direct legal services to qualifying families with students with disabilities who have IEPs in Connecticut through Self Legal Aid, and I am a staff attorney for that. Join us January 14th for another fabulous webinar. We're just giving you a preview of what's to come on planning your annual meeting. We have a really strong, another strong panel of experts to talk about this, as spring is right around the corner, and that's when many annual reviews do take place. I wouldn't be an attorney if I didn't have a disclaimer. So I just want you all to know that this webinar is for informational purposes only. It's intended as a resource to those who are navigating the special education system in Connecticut or New York, and is not intended to provide legal support, advice, or assistance to any particular individual, nor is it intended to replace the advice and counsel of qualified special education attorneys. Families in need of legal advice, support, or assistance should contact a special education attorney licensed to practice in Connecticut, New York, or your state, because I know we have some other people in attendance, to discuss your specific needs of their individual student. And this webinar should not be construed as an endorsement by the Special Education Legal Fund or any of its representatives of any of the participating attorneys, advocates, or other professionals in the panel, nor should it be construed as an endorsement of any school or school representative invited to appear on this panel. And I'm not going to read the bios, but they are here for your available to you. Just going to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Dr. Erin Micali from Sasko River Center. Dr. Micali is a neuropsychologist who conducts many evaluations here in Connecticut. She has a real gift for evaluating by seeing a child through their strengths and navigating complex needs to enable access to education and facilitate growth and development. And this is Erin's first webinar with SELF. So thank you very much for participating, Erin. Next, we have attorney Meredith Braxton of Braxton Law. And Meredith is here for, I believe, your sixth webinar. So you are a frequent contributor. Meredith has over 30-year career in law, including big law, smaller firms, and then for the last 18 or so years, her own firm in special education, where she really is a fierce advocate for enforcing these civil rights. We have Amanda Sylvester, who is head of school at Fusion Academy Fairfield. She was a former teacher and joined Fusion in California as a teacher in 2008 and served in different capacities in several Fusion locations before settling in Fairfield in 2016 to open that campus. We are lucky to have her on this panel as Fusion Academy is one of the places that can really help a family through to the other side of some of the issues that we are going to discuss tonight. And this is Amanda's second webinar, and she's also participated in a Fusion School Showcase. So welcome, Amanda. And finally, we have advocate Mary Waghorne, who, like Erin, is participating for the first time as a panelist. Mary also has a law degree, and before her advocacy work, she practiced law at both large firm and public companies. And we are so happy she changed course and works to help children access an appropriate education. So, onto our panel. We have a lot to cover, and not every panelist will answer every question necessarily, but I encourage you to add whatever you think would be relevant. I will be monitoring the questions and the chat. So if anyone in the audience has questions, you can put them in either of those locations. I will We'll do our best if it's a relevant question to what we're talking about to incorporate it into the discussion. If we have time at the end, we will take some questions at the end, but we may not get to every question. And please do not submit questions that are very specific to your child or a particular situation because we would not be able to address those. So, on to our discussion. I think we're going to start off just kind of broadly, and I'm going to ask each of you to kind of, in a quick sentence or so, how would you define school refusal or school avoidance? And I'm going to start with Meredith. You have to unmute, please.
I would define school avoidance as any behavior by a child where they're resisting going to school. Whether it's complaining about a stomach ache, dragging their feet and getting out, when you see that there's an unwillingness to go to school, like they normally would, that I would call school avoidance. School refusal is when that escalates and they don't want to leave the house or they don't want to leave the car and go through the doors of the school. I would also classify a school refusal as when a child is in school but cannot tolerate the educational environment and winds up spending all day in like the guidance counselor's office or, the principal's office or whatever, something like that.
That was a really good summary of those things. Amanda, do you have anything to add to that? And you are muted also.
Not really. I just think it's like Meredith said, looking for that consistent pattern to see sort of like where you are in that evolutionary sort of stage of avoidance through to refusal. But I do love her point of like, sometimes students are going into the building, but they're not engaging. And I think that's a missed sort of like part of what school refusal and how it could look like for different students. Because you think they're getting up, they're going to school, they're engaging to a degree. They might go to the counselor's office or have those places they feel safe to go. But if they're still not making any academic progress, then there's still a level of avoidance or refusal that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Erin, from your clinical's perspective, do you have anything to add to that just kind of broad definition?
Yeah, I agree with both of you, but I also will add, from a clinical perspective, I'm looking for signs of distress, fear, anxiety, any sort of body symptom, those stomach aches, those headaches. Um, Maybe they're coming out of nowhere, and that could be when we're talking about school, when we're at school, getting ready for school, even thinking about school. Doesn't necessarily have to be in the building, like we've been saying.
Thank you. Mary, you have anything to add to all of that?
Yes, I think all of the panelists gave great definitions. One thing I think it's important to clarify is that I don't see the definition of school avoidance or school refusal as kind of a rule breaking, deliberate behavior like truancy. So I think it's important to distinguish what we're talking about tonight from a more behavioral problem and looking at it rather as something that's coming either from an emotional distress or some other underlying issue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that moves us kind of along on the topic where we've kind of introduced what we're talking about and to more understanding the problem. So I'm going to stick with you for a moment, Mary. And in
Okay.
your advocacy experience working with families, what are the early signs of school avoidance that sort of start to become a concerning pattern?
Good question. So, to me, early signs of school avoidance often include an increase in those physical symptoms, like we talked about a few moments ago, headaches, stomach aches, either as a means of avoiding going to school in the morning or as a means of getting out of school once you're there. In general, we see these complaints not occurring on the weekends or on holidays. So if your child seems to have a headache or a stomach ache every day of the week, but not on the weekend, there's a good chance that it isn't kind of a real medical concern, is probably more of a somatic concern related to school avoidance. Also, a symptom I see particularly with younger children is tantruming in the morning as their form of communication. And, it really ramps up when it's time to get on the bus or get in the car in the morning. And also seeing it when it's time to get out of the car or get into the school building. Often children will drop on the ground and refuse to go into the school. So I think all of those are great signs that your child is avoiding school, and a deeper dive needs to happen.
Thank you, Mary. That was really a great answer. Erin,
Thanks.
I'm going to kind of take what Mary said and turn to you because sometimes, people will look at the student and say these things aren't real. They're not really sick. They're not really having headaches. They're not really having these things. Can you talk to that from your, clinical medical perspective?
Yeah, depending on our age, we don't often have the language to talk about what's happening in our mind-body connection. And middle school, elementary school, even high school kids will externalize that internal feeling with a body symptom because that's kind of what we grew up understanding. And that's often conceptualized as anxiety. One of those really strong indicators for school avoidance and school refusal is anxiety and OCD. And we know that at its core, anxiety is just a body's response to perceived danger. And so when I'm feeling all these heightened things in my body, I'm worried, I'm scared, my stomach's going to feel tighter, so I'm going to have a stomach ache. And I have to focus on myself and feeling safe. And so my vision might feel really pinpointed, and that could feel like losing vision or blurry vision or feeling dizzy, sweaty palms. And that's kind of what's coming out. And it's our job to kind of get to the bottom of it and help teachers to understand, or educators in general to understand those warning signs that this could be something bigger so that we don't snowball into a clinical concern where I have to get involved or any of us have to get involved, and we can stop it a little earlier. And of course, there's other risk factors such as like ADHD or autism, learning disorders. Those things are more likely to have school avoidance and refusal associated with them because the learning environment can be overwhelming and overstimulating.
Thank you, Erin. Amanda, Erin kind of touched a little bit on the school's perspective. So, as an educator, what school-based experiences or environments can maybe unintentionally contribute to the school avoidance or refusal?
There's a lot of things, and it varies so much student to student. And I think to also like echo what Mary and Aaron have said, this is where they go every day. This is like where they're a student, like this is their primary like place in life right now. And so even sometimes the littlest things that we seem or that we may think are unimportant or not that big of a deal are really like life changing for them and can really, derail their progress. And it can be small things, it can be big things, and it can be patterns over time as well. Some of the things that we come across most at Fusion when we're working with students that are coming from situations with school refusal are possible negative peer interactions, if they've had trouble socially, bullying, social exclusion, what we look at as common middle school type of problems, friendships changing, dynamics changing that are really challenging for them to navigate through if they don't have the skills yet to do so. We see a lot of students with performance anxiety where they're really taking, all AP honors level classes. They have perfectionism and they're kind of overloaded. And then the work piles up and they get into this cycle of avoidance and then it builds from there. We see a lot of sensory overload, especially in the larger, really busy schools where students are overwhelmed by the noise, by the lockers, by the hallways, by the number of kids in a one single classroom that, they can't focus because of all these things happening around them it's just really overwhelming for them to survive the day, let alone actually learn while they're there. Challenges sometimes with teachers or other, school administrators, if they're not feeling connected, like they don't have that person to go to where they're feeling really heard and understood by someone in the building can be a challenge. And then, of course, we come across undiagnosed learning differences where students are diagnosed late in the game with something like dyslexia and teachers are, not understanding that there's this deeper problem happening. So there's a lot of things that can be going on and there's a lot of overlapping challenges as well. But those are probably the most common ones that we're at least seeing at our end of it.
Thank you. And so, Meredith, turning to you as the attorney, we've heard about a lot of things that go into this. When does it trigger a school district's legal responsibilities under the IDEA or Section 504 when these things are happening?
First, I want to tag on a little bit to what Amanda was saying.
Of course.
So what I see a lot of times at the younger ages is as kids who do have skill deficits, like with reading or math or whatever, as they become aware of how their performance differs from their peers, that will often trigger the beginning of school avoidance and school refusal because they're embarrassed.
Yeah. And I just want to add, my experience is that's that third to fourth grade area, right? That's when I just see it explode.
Yep. So under both IDEA and Section 504, the trigger is that the school should be suspecting a disability, right? So there's, in my opinion, if a kid is refusing or avoiding school, you should be suspecting a disability, certainly an emotional disability, but others as well, like, a specific learning disability or, whatever. A lot of times what you hear back from the school is, well, he or she is fine when they're here, so we don't suspect a disability. So in Connecticut, we have a very handy regulation that helps us here and puts this back on the school district. And it's 10-76D-7C. And it says provision shall be made for the prompt referral to a planning and placement team of all children who have been suspended repeatedly or whose behavior, attendance, including truant behavior, or progress in school is considered unsatisfactory or at a marginal level of acceptance. So, you can cite that regulation and say you have to refer this kid to special education. So that's the trigger. And I would encourage people to refer as soon as possible because school districts tend to go right to truancy or DCF.
And I'm going to ask about that, but somebody mentioned, the student that's in all the AP classes and they're doing terrific. And we frequently hear the students getting all A's. So what, there's no disability, there's no issue. Can you talk to that?
Sure. Grades are not the determination of whether a kid has a disability or not in any way, shape, or form. If a kid is missing a whole bunch of instruction, that's an educational impact. And education is more than academics. It's also social emotional functioning. It's also executive functioning. We have all of the sort of functional areas that you see in an IEP. That count toward whether there's educational impact. So, okay, maybe they have great grades, but, there may be other things going on that interfere with their functioning at school. And
Yep.
Schools are not receptive to those arguments generally, but hearing officers are. So,
And then just to circle back to what you said, a lot of times we'll see that schools start sending truancy notices home, or they're reporting families to DCF. What are the rights of the family when those things are happening?
well, I mean, you should get help, first of all. You should get legal help. But somebody has to get in there and say, no, what's really happening here is the school district isn't fulfilling its responsibilities. I haven't done a lot of truancy work, so I'm not sure exactly how that court works, the juvenile court works with that. But I know that with DCF, a lot of times, first of all, they really get mad when school districts report a kid or a family when the family is doing everything they possibly can to help this kid, and what's happening is the school is falling down on the job. And in those cases, DCF winds up being really helpful a lot of the time, and they'll come and testify in a hearing, and they can come to a PPT and add their heft to, no, you need to be doing something school. So I would not necessarily be afraid of DCF.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because sometimes the districts may use it punitively and it causes the parents shame.
Yeah.
And they really should look at it as an opportunity to have another voice for support rather than that. So thank you for pointing that out. So we've kind of talked about the problem. We're going to move a little bit to identifying needs and gathering some information. So Amanda, I'm going to come back to you. What questions should schools or educators be asking to better understand why a student is struggling?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We try to think in a broad sense, but also get really specific at the same time, which is difficult to do, but you really want to look at like a multifaceted approach to like what might be going on, right? Because there's so many factors that impact, and it might, and like I kind of mentioned before, it may start with one seemingly insignificant sort of event, but then it might spiral from there, right? So you have to kind of get specific and really curious with the types of questions you're asking the student, the types of questions you're asking the family, how you're engaging with the teachers to explore further what's going on within each class specifically. And not make assumptions along the way as well. And going back to the fact that kids do well when they can. Like they're not doing this on purpose. Like this is not a behavioral problem. They're not, if they could get themselves to school, most of the time they're going to, right? So it's also really important to approach that conversation if you're having this conversation with the student themselves, depending on the age and how appropriate that is. To make sure that you're not approaching that conversation with that punitive sort of lens of, like you got to just get yourself to school. If they could get themselves to school, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It would be a lot easier. But we really try to dig into, how are they feeling? Are there specific situations? How are they feeling? As Erin said, like, how are you feeling in the morning? What's coming up for you? Like, from that standpoint, are there specific classes you feel are harder than others? Is there a time at school or situation that's made you feel unsafe or uncomfortable? What could kind of make this situation for you easier? We often look at what's going on at home as well, because oftentimes there's situations and other things going on within the household that we don't know about. That's really where some of the challenges are coming from. So looking at like what those family routines are, how maybe other situations with other siblings could potentially be impacting that student and the family dynamic. It's really important also, I think, not necessarily from the school, but from a school supporting maybe a mental health professional with the family to also talk to the parents about what their role is, and how they may have impacted the situation, but what they can do to, give that consistency or accountability and support to the student as well. And then looking at patterns within the school environment. So are there specific days that they're absent more often than others? Are there specific classes that they seem to be avoiding more than others? And that could be academically related. It could be more socially related as well. They could be fine in the morning up until when lunch happens and they're really scared to go to the lunchroom. So that could be the reason. So it's about getting broad, but also getting specific and really curious to investigate sort of all these different buckets that students go through throughout the day and how they could each sort of be impacting the situation to try to see then what might the approach be to support sort of like what you uncover through those conversations.
Sure. So, Mary, Amanda referred to a lot of different data points in what she was saying. So, when you're working with a family, what documentation or data is most helpful for understanding these patterns so that you can use that when you're addressing the school?
Good question. So, when I first start working with a client that has school avoidant issues, kind of like Amanda suggested, I like to start looking at, days missed, tardies, trips to the nurse's office, early departures, you know, and looking at their most recent evaluations, if any, to really understand if there are different emotional or learning needs that also may be compounded. Um, Again, I like to drill down into the times the absences are happening, as Amanda suggested, the timing of trips to the nurse's office or the time a class is skipped often relates to a deficit in knowledge or anxiety or some other reason that's causing the avoidant behavior to occur. And then another thing that I think is really helpful is asking the school team to get an outside behavioral health provider involved that can do a functional behavioral assessment for absenteeism and truancy. It's called an FBAT, and it's a newer functional behavioral analysis that is used in this area. It generally includes interviews with all the stakeholders, like the parents, the teachers, the student, any clinicians at school. There's also a core checklist that forms the foundation of that evaluation. It has 112 questions that the parents and the children go through and answer with the clinician to really understand, like, learning challenges, emotional challenges, whether there are specific motivating events, if they're, what the antecedents to the behavior are, if there are skill deficits, also looking at consequences related to absenteeism. So I think, like I said, getting a BCBA involved that can do this FBAT is a great start to really figuring out how to build a roadmap to kind of correct the underlying difficulties so that a roadmap for re-engagement can be developed for the child.
Thank you. And I just want to comment. One thing that Mary mentioned was the nurse's logs or the counselor logs. And I just want to make sure parents understand that they are entitled to those things and frequently don't get them because you may not know how frequently your child is actually going to the nurse's office. But Erin, I want to jump on what Mary was talking about. She was focusing more on kind of the behavioral evaluations. So, from your perspective, what are the signs that an evaluation may be necessary or helpful, and what are the things that you would be looking at in an evaluation?
Yeah. So in many ways, a lot of what we're looking for is overlapping. An evaluation can be really helpful when we're seeing a child who is starting to avoid certain times of day, which can indicate that there might be a particular class or group of classes that are difficult. Or if you're seeing a child who is showing behaviors that are outside of what we would consider their baseline behavior group. And what I mean by that is maybe suddenly they are escalating emotionally or physically or onto their peers or they're isolating. And those are some indicators that something is shifting. And the purpose of this is to find that like underlying piece here so that we can target the actual like what let's say why are we avoiding or refusing school rather than just putting a band-aid on getting them through the door and having them sit in the school. And we do that through a variety of ways. There are rating scales, there's interviews, but then we also will look at their academics. Are they on trajectory? Are they ahead? They behind? We'll look at attention and executive functioning because a lot of academics after third grade do have a lot of components of executive function and independent learning, especially in this area of the country. So was that shift from like learning to read to reading to learn and that executive function load from co-regulated to independent learning, was that really difficult? And do we need to put some supports in place? And that's where we can make these recommendations that are very targeted to the individual and their unique strengths and vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Mary, there is a question. What was the evaluation that you mentioned and what was the acronym for it?
It's the functional behavioral assessment of absenteeism and truancy, and it's known colloquially as the FBAT, FBAAT.
Thank you.
You're
Meredith, somebody
welcome.
asked for the regulation too to be put in the chat, and I just can't stop to type it. So just remind me, and at the end we'll put it in there. Erin, I just want to follow up on how does a parent distinguish between a child who won't go to school and a child who can't go to school due to a certain amount of anxiety or distress that they're experiencing?
It's a really, really good question, because usually won't snowballs into can't, because anxiety is a reinforcing cycle. And so a lot of times it's the parent has to kind of be an investigator and track some data at first. So looking for some patterns, and that's where people like myself come in and can help, because we're looking for things like increasing absences or time spent in the nurse, out of class, leaving early from class. We're also looking for like shifts in mood. So are they suddenly in a really good mood Friday, Saturday, and then do you see that downward tick on Sunday, Monday? And are they complaining of body complaints like we discussed earlier? Or are we thinking about things like sleep? Sleep follows a very similar pattern. They might get really poor sleep Monday through Thursday and then on Sunday, but get really good sleep Friday and Saturday, or the reverse, they might sleep a lot. And of course, you want to speak with your pediatrician and make sure there's no biological or organic causes for any of these things. But if the organic cause is not there, then that's a good sign that we're kind of teetering into that difficulty, that anxiety is being reinforced, and we're getting into the we cannot. Also, you can see some things like age inappropriate behaviors. So regression, if they're kind of clinging to you and having a hard time separating, and that doesn't have to necessarily be at school. That could be in social settings like at hockey practice or at piano, where they're really quite used to the setting, or even a family friend, or a difficulty like getting started in the morning. And they may not be able to articulate why it's happening. And they might really want to go to school and have a plan of how they'll get there, but every morning that plan kind of falls apart. That's a big indicator as well. A lot of the kids we work with, they do want to go to school. They just have a very difficult time executing the plan because anxiety is so debilitating.
Thank you. So, Meredith, that bounces me back to you because we've got kids that are potentially missing a lot of not only service time, but academic time and general school time. So, what legal protections apply when a student is missing substantial instructional time due to the anxiety or the school refusal that we're talking about?
Well, so most of the time, kids who are experiencing school avoidance or school refusal should be qualified for special education, either under emotional disability or under one of the other things we're talking about, OHI for ADHD with executive functioning issues or, specific learning disability. So, they're entitled to a free appropriate public education when they are qualified for special education. And when they're missing a whole lot of instruction, of course, they're not getting that appropriate education. That gives rise to a compensatory education claim that you can bring to this, to the school. You can bring it to due process, demanding that they make up that time, make up the instruction that was lost. And, on top of that, the school district does have a child find duty. So they are required, if they should suspect a disability, if they had reason to suspect a disability, they have a duty to evaluate a child and see whether they do have a disability. If they have just let a kid sit home for a year and haven't done anything to evaluate them, that's a child fine violation. And it's kind of a per se, because you should have evaluated them, you should have found them eligible, and you should have given them an appropriate education, and you didn't. So that gives rise to a kind of a massive compensatory education claim. And, we use that in various ways. You can use it to make up at sort of at the back end, when they're aging out or, getting a high school diploma, or you can use it to get a more intensive sort of out of district placement, at the time that you're talking about. So, there are legal protections anytime a school should be suspecting a disability and should be doing something about it. And it's not, the law is written so that it isn't incumbent on the parent to bring it to the school district. Of course, you should. If you're suspecting something, you should, but the law does not put that on the parent's plate. It is squarely on the school's plate. So, so there are protections, but I would encourage anyone to go right to the school the moment they're thinking something is going on. Be really not ambiguous about it. Say my kid has a disability, or I think they have a disability, cite that regulation, and say, you have to do something now. So that's my advice.
And do that in writing to the school district.
In writing, absolutely.
Uh, so Amanda, Fusion is a school where a lot of students like this do end up. And I don't know that everyone in our audience is aware that there are opportunities outside of the school district to address some of these problems. So can you talk about how a school like Fusion can be really effective in these situations, and what a flexible or responsive environment can look like for a kid who is experiencing significant avoidance?
Yeah, we're really fortunate at Fusion because we're a private school, so we can, we operate essentially independently from state requirements, things like that, which allows us to be really kind of above and beyond in our flexibility and our individualized approach. At Fusion, all of our classes are one-to-one, and we, again, offer flexible scheduling, and our school environment is extremely different from a more traditional school environment. So our school space, the way that it's set up, the way the classrooms are set up, they're very small, intimate kind of rooms with the teacher and the student. Our social spaces, our common spaces are really comfortable with like cozy couches and big chairs, and the lighting's intentional, the smells intentional, the colors are intentional. And that's intentional because students, really have a hard time sometimes with that larger school environment where it just feels like they're like I mentioned earlier, just really overwhelmed from a sensory standpoint. So there's a lot of different things kind of built into our program specifically, like the environment, like the one-to-one approach. So if students are having trouble in a classroom setting, if it's from an academic standpoint, if they have a learning difference that they're having trouble with, where we talked a little bit about that shame that can come with not feeling like you're where the rest of the class is at. You don't want to raise your hand, you're falling behind. We work a lot with students with ADHD, where this is really common because they're filtering so many things at once throughout the day. And so they're really just trying to survive and find and get through the space rather than being able to actually be fully present to learn. And so they're constantly falling behind in that sense. So when you're working in a one-to-one capacity, it really allows the teacher to monitor that much more closely and be in a sort of, one-to-one environment where they don't have to worry about what's going on with other students. And then with our flexible scheduling, we really try to create schedules and times for students to attend school that work best for them. So if they have a really hard time in the mornings and they don't sleep well, then maybe they need to start at like 10:30. A lot of what we do at Fusion, though, are different things that parents can request for at a public school or a different private school as well. I think Mary Meredith can speak to this as well, as like, how do you advocate for your child in that sense, in those settings, and get what you need? So all these types of things, a personalized attendance plan, what days of the week, partial day schedules, later starts, earlier end times, consistent routines, relationships with adults, making sure that they have their point person, academic flexibility where they might just do modified assignments or key assignments can sometimes be really impactful, where they're not, responsible for the daily homework assignments, but they do the key most important things. Making sure that, again, I think that non-punitive approach is really important, and how you collaborate and individualize the plan based on the student. And I think where a lot of the support from people like Mary and Meredith come in is really supporting parents to advocate for their child for these types of things that they can ask for, and holding the school accountable to actually follow through. I think that's sometimes where we end up then with students, is when students and families aren't feeling like the school is following through on these types of plans that they've tried to put in place, or that the school is putting things in place that really don't align with the root cause of what's going on in terms of like the school avoidance and the school refusal, and why it's actually happening. They might put things in place that actually don't address that problem for that particular child, at least.
Thank you, Amanda. Mary, Amanda mentioned that the supports that will be needed in school, because we always want the child to return to their peers and their neighborhood school and those things. So, out of the things that Amanda mentioned, do you have any additional things to add that might help in a student to feel safe if they were to return to their school district?
Um, so, you know, I think first I want to say that often the schools start to provide the accommodations and the supports before the child may even be starting to return to class. So oftentimes I've seen some of the underlying issues being addressed while a student may even be receiving one-to-one tutoring at a setting outside of the physical school building. Like, for example, in the public library with a one-to-one tutor, and having some school personnel filtering into that setting occasionally to kind of reintegrate the child in the business of school without the actual school building. And I think this approach, in addition to the many specific accommodations that Amanda mentioned, can be incredibly helpful as the child is seeking to alleviate their anxiety and build more confidence in their ability to attend school in the actual school building. I also see circumstances where students can begin to return to school in a therapeutic in-school program, and again, also receive one-to-one tutoring in a space in the school that is separate from all the other children. And again, working with clinicians to have a gradual transition to the actual school setting, maybe one class at a time. Um, and then, as we've spoken about, there are other students who are going to require a whole separate setting, like a fusion or a specialized special education program or special therapeutic program. And then there's still other students who might require mental health treatment or, other intensive programming before, the school team can even look at how they introduce the educational piece to the child's day. There might be underlying emotional health difficulties that need to be addressed first before they can attend to school.
Thank you, Mary. And I just want to let the audience know that this is being recorded, because there's a lot of things being thrown at you in terms of accommodations or plans. So you can sit back, you can listen to it later. You'll get a copy of the recording so that you can re-listen to those parts that you may want to pick some things out of. Um, so, Erin, we've talked about a lot of in-school supports or returning school supports. Are there other therapeutic approaches or things that can happen outside of the school environment or within the school environment that you would like to add?
Yeah, when considering therapy, I highly recommend considering like a two-prong approach. Cognitive behavioral therapy is fantastic. It's actually like our gold standard for this type of concern. Anxiety affects the way we think and interact with the world, and cognitive behavioral therapy can really help us to tolerate that distress and those negative thought patterns and address them head on. And in some cases, exposure and response prevention, ERP, is necessary so that clinician can kind of go into a school, especially a school like Fusion that has that flexibility, and work where that high anxiety is to help the child kind of ride that wave and hit the peak of the most anxiety-inducing experience and come back down and see, okay, it wasn't that scary. And what can I do? And introduce coping skills and introduce new thought patterns in the moment. But for some children, we also know that that's just not possible. Some kids are averse to therapy, and some type of therapies don't work for everybody. And for that, I really highly recommend a parenting approach as well. So a parent coach space therapy is fantastic. So SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. It's an evidence-based treatment right out of Yale Child Study Center, and their trials say it's as effective as cognitive behavioral, so CBT. And the best part is that for those kids who really don't want to be part of therapy, even though the child's the identified client, the parent's doing all of the work. So the kids don't actually have to be part of therapy, even though they get to kind of reap the benefits of therapy. The whole family system is making changes so that the anxiety and the way we're accommodating anxiety is different. So we're seeing systemic changes. And that kind of goes back to making those long-term changes. So we're not just attacking a short-term problem, we're kind of going to the root of it.
Yeah, I want to just tag on to that. I
Of
totally
course.
what Erin is saying about, I've had clients use the SPACE program, but when you're a parent of a child who's, having issues, it's always hard to figure out, like, find that line between when you're being supportive and when you're enabling behavior that's not good for the kid. And these programs really help parents figure that out and navigate that line. And it's such a confusing thing, really, for a parent. It's almost impossible. You really need professional help to figure out how to deal with that. And so when that refusal is starting in the home, it's helpful if parents have some tools, to bring out there. So sorry, Erin, I just wanted to
No, that's perfectly
voice that,
said.
so
Yeah, that's great. And for people listening, their anxious child has to go to school tomorrow. Erin, do you have any practical like morning strategy that a parent can use to help reduce anxiety before school if their child is experiencing this?
I would reduce the morning routine to the bare minimum. So whatever you can do at nighttime, whether that be pack your lunch, make sure their sports bags, their backpacks, everything they need is packed, they're showered at night. Um, and that's because anxiety loves predictability and it loves consistency and routine. And the less things that can be wonky or go off our routine, the better. And gradually we can kind of add things back in. But if our kiddos know we only have to get up, eat breakfast, which is already going to be made for us or is already on the table, I just have to pour it and then brush my teeth and get on the bus, it's a lot more manageable than a 10-step routine. And starting really small, smaller than you think, is going to be a lot more manageable in these situations.
That's great advice. Meredith, if we're looking at a reintegration program, legally, does it have to be an all or nothing, or what looks like a realistic return to school plan for a child? You're muted. I'm sorry.
whatever's going to work for that kid is reasonable legally. You can try a million things that don't work, and that's not going to be an appropriate program for the child. So, it can be anything from, they just come in for lunch and, are tutored outside otherwise, to, they're doing a couple of classes, or they're completely separate from school, and as Mary was saying before, maybe they're doing their tutoring at the library first, and then they're slowly approaching getting back to school. But one of the things that I've found is sort of most effective, like if you don't have this, it just doesn't work, is they need to feel a connection to somebody at school. They need to have someone who they feel like they can go to, who they feel safe with, who, they feel has their back, is on their side. If there's no one in the school like that, you're going to have a much harder time getting that child there. But really, on a legal basis, you can advocate for almost anything that will be effective in getting that child, reintegrated.
So
So,
my follow-up there is if we're dealing with a high schooler and the school starts talking about credit accumulation and all of that, how does that affect a student's trajectory for graduation? And also there's a question in the chat about if a student is attending partial day, who's responsible for transporting that child to the school?
oh, it's still the school district that's responsible for transporting that child at whatever time is working.
All right, that's a quick answer. Yep.
Yep, that's an easy one. When kids are falling short of credits, there are credit recovery programs. I'm not a huge fan because you wind up not really getting the whole course. You're getting a very slimmed down course. Um, so I just, I don't know. Educationally, I don't feel like it's a great option. I'd rather see them go to fusion or, something like that. Um, so, but you know, what was, I'm sorry.
I mean, basically, if a student's missing and they're slowly reintegrating and they're in high school and they're missing core courses, can that affect their graduation
Well,
date?
yeah, because they need to have a certain number of credits to meet a certain number of credits. There are some that can be waived, right? Like you can waive PE, right? They don't have to, like,
Foreign language or
yeah, foreign language, if that's a problem, if the kid doesn't want to get into a bathing suit and get into the pool, waive the swimming requirement. Stuff like that can be waived, the like little things like, 4 years of English and, 3 years of science. That's harder, although not impossible, to deal with. And honestly, if your child is way behind on credits, um, probably they're going to need transition services anyway, which are services that are supposed to prepare your child for post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. So I normally don't get too excited about the whole credit thing. Um, if a child is really, far behind because we really should be looking at that transition piece as well. So I'm not in a hurry to put a diploma in their hands.
and there's a question relevant to this. If a child is in a transition program, do these same rules apply if they are showing avoidance in that program?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Then that program is not appropriate for them. If it's not effective, the measure of whether something is appropriate is, are they making progress? Right? If they are not making progress, then that program is not appropriate and it's a denial of a free, appropriate public education. So, you have grounds to go back and say, no, we need to do something else because this is not cutting it. Um, and also don't let them put your kid on homebound. Just that's a whole nother subject.
Yeah, it's another webinar. Yeah. So, Amanda, I want to follow through on this because I know through experience that Fusion or schools like Fusion do have the ability to make up a lot of time because it's so individualized. So, I do want you to talk to that. And then also just, how are we building trust through the schools to re-engage kids who have been disconnected from learning for so long?
Yeah, so to answer your first part, I mean, we have students currently with us that are, would have otherwise graduated, or their class had already graduated a year ago, 2 years ago, that really, didn't want to go the route of a GED, really, academically speaking, are fully capable of, going through a full high school course trajectory and didn't want to let that go. In some cases, parents have been successful working with districts. In other cases, parents have decided to completely do this on their own, and pay for Fusion privately, because we can extend that offering, beyond, students that are 18 or 19 years old. And they can get a full diploma from Fusion and then have all those opportunities go off to college, whatever that choice may be. We also, though, do see we're open all summer. So students and parents have been successful in coming to Fusion in the summer to take one or two classes if they're just, need to chip away at a couple of things. So that's always an option as well. But certainly more for those more extreme cases, we've been able to support students that, really fall off track in terms of meeting graduation requirements at the high school level or more traditional high school. And then they get to the point where they don't want to be going to the high school because everybody they know has already moved on, right? So then that's a whole other problem is, why are we trying to force them into this school setting and sitting in class with kids that are 2 years younger than them, which is, really emotionally distressing for students at that point as well. And then in terms of building trust, I agree. Meredith mentioned this a few minutes ago, where they have to have a point person. They have to feel that connection, and that consistent support and follow through has to be there. If they don't feel validated, if they don't feel valued, if they don't feel understood, if they don't feel, if they feel like the approach has been punitive and that they think that these are fake problems and not really things that are going on for them, they're not going to re-engage. But if they have adults in the school setting, if they have hopefully peers as well, but I think more specifically, at least one and then multiple if possible that they feel really connected to and they feel like they belong. I think that's the place to start, and the academics will come from, will follow. But if they're not feeling like they feel connected and understood and supported, then they're never going to re-engage, right? They just don't see what the point is because no one understands them anyways. So that's always where we start. That's where, when we have students that aren't successful re-engaging into a school setting through when they were going through school refusal, that's a common thing that they have said. I just met with a family today where they specifically said he doesn't feel connected with anybody at school. No, he doesn't feel like anybody is there for him, that anybody understands what he's going through, and that they think he's making it up. And why, he doesn't want to show up because of that. So that connection and that consistent follow through and support on an emotional level, I think is baseline, the most important thing to re-engage and develop that level of trust.
Thank you very much. We are drawing to the end, and I want to give each panelist just kind of an opportunity to take 30 seconds and convey either what they wish every parent understood about this issue, or just some final thoughts that they have. Mary, I'm going to start with you.
Great question, Laura. I want to make sure every parent understands that school avoidance can happen to anyone. It doesn't mean your child is a bad kid. It doesn't mean that your child is being manipulative. I think, the most important thing is for parents to really try and kind of catch the behavior as soon as possible and make the referral for special education to the school, and make sure that if the teachers and the school are telling you, that this is behavior and it's the child's fault, to require them to dig deeper and figure out what is really going on. In my experience, this generally speaking is not a bad behavior problem or manipulative problem. We far more often see it as like either a learning disability or an emotional issue. And parents really need to feel empowered to follow their gut and put back to the school the need for them to dig deeper and figure out what the problem is.
Thank you. Erin?
I think that I would like everyone to remember that school refusal is often the visible symptom of something that's underlying, and that catching it early and often is very helpful. And the best way to do that is in collaboration with all the people who spend a lot of time with our kids. So, coaches, teachers, school, it can be really scary to ask for help or admit that you're seeing something that's happening with your son or your daughter. But we talked a lot about data tonight and having data points that asking for help at that initial point when you're noticing that in third, fourth grade is a data point that's going to follow them through high school. So you're starting to collect if this is becoming a pattern of behavior to help people like myself and everyone in this room to help your child to recognize that underlying cause earlier and so that we can help you all to help your kiddos.
Thank you. Amanda?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is as Mary said, kind of, really try to look out for those signs early, get curious, ask questions, really try not to be punitive or dismissive and just understand that this is real to them, right? It's causing them not to function in a normal way. But getting curious and really coming from a place of being open-minded and trying to have that deep level of understanding of what they're going through. And that ongoing conversation can really open the door for the child to, advocate and express maybe some specific types of things that are going on and potentially help you get to the root cause, sooner.
Thank you. And Meredith? You're muted.
First, it's just not unreasonable for a kid to want to feel connection, acceptance, and some success at school, right? So if they're not getting that, that's not their thing. The school remains responsible for educating your child, and it's not your child's fault that it's not happening. Um, like Mary said, you should be referring as soon as possible. You should be doing it in writing. You should be citing that regulation because they always forget it's there. And you shouldn't go it alone. You should find somebody like Mary or parent groups, Sometimes there are PTA special education groups that can be helpful, but you shouldn't go it alone. You will find other people who are in the same boat. You will find other people who do know how to advocate. Um, find your tribe and you can find help in supporting your child. So.
Thank you. I really want to thank our panelists. I think this was a really important and really thorough discussion with a lot of practical things that parents can do to support their children that are in this. So thank you, all of you. I want to thank Fusion for sponsoring, being our corporate sponsor for this, and remind everyone that we've got another great webinar coming up January. The Eventbrite will be going out in a few days, so please look out for that. And I want to wish everyone a very happy holiday season and look forward to seeing you all next year as we continue our webinar series. So have a great night and thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.